The webinar will begin shortly. Please remain on the line. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lori Raridan. I'm the Environmental Health Coordinator for the Division of Public Health Services in the Department of Health and Human Services in New Hampshire. And we're here tonight to talk about the report on PFAS in private wells near the Saint Gobain Site in Merrimack, New Hampshire. We're going to wait a couple of more minutes till about 6:33 till we get most of the folks online who are joining us. We have quite a few folks who've signed up. And right now our amazing technology shows us that not everyone is here. So bear with us. And in the meantime, I will entertain you by remarking on the fact that it's 2/2/22 today, which I think is kind of cool. I don't know if Puxatawny Phil saw his shadow, but maybe some of you, yes, I'm seeing a yes from Tara. So I forget if that means there's more winter to come. That would be fine with me as I'm a skiing fan here in New Hampshire, but I know it's always a mixed bag for folks. But I hope everyone's doing well. I want to say a hi to those of you out there who I know, and those of you who I don't know, I hope I'll meet you. I wish we were meeting in person, and I hope that we will be able to do that again soon. It's so much better that way. But thanks for bearing with us. And we have this amazing technology that allows us to meet virtually, but you know what that means. It also means that sometimes we have some technology glitches. So we've done all of our homework, and we hope there aren't any, but it's invariably true that there always are some. So be patient, and we appreciate you being here, and we'll get started in about a minute or so. We do have more people coming on, which is exciting. All right, I'm going to get us rolling. So, as I said, welcome. My name is Lori Raridan. I'm the Environmental Health Coordinator for the New Hampshire Division of Public Health Services within the Department of Health and Human Services. And tonight we have a team from Atsdr who will be explaining the report, the draft report. And I'm going to introduce Tara Summers, who is the Regional Atsdr Director for the Boston office. The Atsdr is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of the Centers for Disease Control. Also here is Jill Dyken, who is the primary report author. And there are a couple of other team members, Michelle and Greg, who will be introduced later when we get to our Q&A session. I'm going to go through some housekeeping things just to set the stage. I will be moderating the Q&A portion when we get there. So can I have that next slide, Jenna? So I just want to let you know that we have this list of information. It's here on the slide. It's also in the handout section on your dashboard of the GoToMeeting panel on your screen. It should be on the right side. You'll see 3 PDFs there at the moment. One is the summary of the Atsdr Health consultation, one is the full document, and one is this contact information that you see on the slide. We just want to make sure you have this. If there are questions or concerns that come up that are outside of the scope of this report presentation tonight, then we'll be referring you to these folks. So I'm going to go through this slide, and if folks have additional questions, we can address those later. But so for general questions relating to PFAS and funding, you would contact Amy Russo. Her information is there. Health and exposure concerns, Jonathan Patali. Air-related issues, Catherine Beam. These folks are all part of New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services. For site investigations within the consent decree, Jeff Martz. For site investigations outside the consent decree, Amy Doherty. Drinking water questions would be Brandon Kernan. And at the New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, if you have cancer concerns, please be in touch with Whitney Hammond. We also understand that there are some concerns about elevated cancer cases in Merrimack and the Saint Gobain Pfas investigation. So again, if those are questions that you have, you can direct them to the folks that are listed on this slide or on the PDF. And we also realized that we recently had, through DHHS, a meeting was held last week relating to cancer concerns in the community. And if you do have questions pertaining to that meeting, you can be in touch with Whitney Hammond, the Chronic Disease Director. She is also a part of the Cancer Concern Review Team. And there is a recording of that meeting, which was held on January 27th. And that is a YouTube recording. We'll try to post that in the chat. And we also, you can search that for the DHHS YouTube channel. And that was held on January 27th. So we can move to the next slide. A few logistics for tonight. If you want to raise your hand, this slide shows you where that icon is, that you click on that and that'll allow you to raise your hand. And if you have, you should raise your hand if you're having some technical issues, and Robert Thistle will be in touch to help you out. If you're having other issues, you can also email him at that email on your screen or call him 271-4608. robert.thistle@des.nh.gov. So that's what you should do if you're having any technical difficulties. Just let us know and Rob will be there to help you out. Next slide. Now, to ask a question when we get to that portion of the meeting tonight, we will have you click where it says question, and you will type your first and last name and then press send. People with questions will be called on in order, and all you need to do is type in your name. You do not need to type in the question, because we will unmute you, then you will unmute yourself, and then you will be able to ask your question. We ask that you just ask one question so that everyone has a chance to ask one question. And then if you have additional questions, you can put your name back in, doing that same process, clicking on the question, typing in your name, and then your name will appear again at the bottom of the list. And depending on how the time goes, we will get to those. But we want to make sure that everyone has a chance to be heard and everyone has a chance to ask their question. So let me just make sure I'm hitting all of my notes. We will have a link to this presentation by ATSDR on the New Hampshire PFAS investigation website afterwards. And if you are using your phone for the audio, you will be unmuted when your name is called, and then you unmute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone. And again, if you have any technical difficulties, let us know by being in touch with Rob. Next slide. So just a few ground rules for the question and answer part of the meeting. Please keep your question brief so everyone has a chance to participate. Be polite, patient, and know that we are listening and we want you to be heard. Thank you. We have quite a few folks who are participating, so we just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask their question. And I think with that, We will be sending out a follow-up email after this meeting, probably in the next day or so, and that email will include all the related resources that we talk about or mention tonight, as well as the 3 PDFs that are in the handouts box on your GoToMeeting dashboard, and any other information that we feel might be helpful to you. So you will get that email in the next day or so. And I think that's it. So I'm going to turn it over to Tara and Jill to start the presentation. Thank you. Oh, I did forget to mention, which Jill I'm sure will, that if the comments that you give tonight as part of your questions are not considered formal comments. So we encourage you to submit a formal comment during the public comment period. And that information was on the previous slide, but Jill, I'm assuming you're going to mention that too. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lori. I think Tara is going to start off for us. Can everybody hear me? And I just want to confirm if the main slide is showing.
Yes.
And does it have the go-to dashboard stuck on top of it?
Nope.
No? Okay, great. Oh, oops, okay.
All right.
Go ahead, Tara.
Sure, thanks. So welcome to our ATSDR meeting so we can discuss the public comment version of our document that we did on PFAS in private drinking water wells near the Saint Gobain Site in the Merrimack, New Hampshire area. So this is our meeting for the public comment version. Just so you're aware, when ATSDR releases a document, what we do is before the final version is released, we do a public comment version, and that gives a chance for anybody in the community or anywhere to send comments to us that we can then address in the final version of the document. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just so you're aware, this is not the final version of this document, and this is your chance as community members to give us feedback and ask questions. So tonight we have 4 ATSDR staff participating in the meeting with us. We have Dr. Jill Dykin. She's the document author, who you just heard briefly, and she'll do the bulk of the presentation for us. We have Dr. Greg Ulrich, who is one of our Associate Directors of Science. We have Dr. Michelle Zieger. She's a physician with us at ATSDR. And myself, Tara Summers. I'm the Regional Director for ATSDR Region 1. And I'd really like to thank all of our New Hampshire Cooperative Agreement partners from New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services and New Hampshire Department of Health and Human Services, who are also joining with us tonight and who've helped provide the platform from this meeting. And we'll introduce some more of them later in the meeting, but you already met Lori, who's helping us facilitate, so special thank you to her. So I think the next slide. So this is the outline for our meeting this evening, so you know how it's going to flow. We set aside about 90 minutes for the meeting. It's going to start off with I'm going to give you a really brief overview of ATSDR, and then Jill's going to present on the report findings, which should take about 15 or 20 minutes. We'll talk to you about how you can send formal comments to ATSDR, which we can then have them addressed in the final version of the document. And the bulk of the time will likely be for questions and answers. All right, next slide. There we go. So ATSDR is the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. It's kind of a long name. We're a federal non-regulatory public health agency under the Department of Health and Human Services. So we work to evaluate the public health effects from exposures to environmental contaminants, particularly in communities that are near hazardous waste sites or that have been referred to us through sometimes it's EPA or sometimes the state health department. We work on all the national priority list sites, which are Superfund sites, but like I said, we also work on some other sites that are referred to us. Our headquarters is in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have 10 regional offices, and our New England office is Region 1, so we cover all 6 of our New England states. And then next slide, which I think Jill starts your slides.
Yeah, hey, and thanks, Tara, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to give a real brief background of the findings of our report that's out for public comment. It probably won't even take 15 or 20 minutes, but we want to give plenty of time for questions and comments. Just as way of background, the Saint Gobain facility in Merrimack, New Hampshire used several PFAS, including perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, in its processes. And in 2016, PFOA was found in groundwater near the site. Since then, the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, or DES, has led sampling of public water systems and private wells in the area of southern New Hampshire surrounding the facility. State and local officials have taken several actions to reduce exposures, including treating public water supplies and providing alternate or treated water to affected private well owners. So New Hampshire DES and the Department of Health and Human Services, or DHHS, asked ATSDR to do this evaluation. Since 2016, we've been working with the state to provide health information to the public regarding PFAS exposure. But in 2019, the state provided us with data on PFAS from public and private drinking water supplies. Those data were extracted from the database of all PFAS sampling results reported to the state. And then in April of last year, we were provided by the state additional data on private wells. So we had newer data for those wells. Now, the report we are talking about tonight focused on the private well data, and we're going to be releasing a separate report evaluating the public water supplies exposure. So our report is focusing on private well data, and I'm also like to tell you that we're also focusing in the report, we only evaluated drinking from that private well water. We didn't evaluate inhalation or breathing in or skin contact exposures, but those exposures are likely to be small compared to the drinking water exposures. Our evaluation also did not include exposures from any other segments of the environment, like air or soil exposures, or any other contaminants besides PFAS. So the state asked us to evaluate private well data from 5 towns in southern New Hampshire near the Saint Gobain facility. They're shown on this map, which is a figure from our report. And the 5 towns were Merrimack, Litchfield, Londonderry, Bedford, and Manchester. And this figure from the report shows the wells and their general locations. And we had data from over 2,700 wells in the area. And the data were collected between March 2016 and up until April of last year, of 2021. And our report had 2 major findings, which I'll go into on the upcoming slides. The first major finding is that before actions began in 2016 to reduce exposures, drinking private well water contaminated with PFAS could have increased the risk for harmful health effects for some community members. We found that most of the private wells in the 5 towns evaluated were contaminated with PFAS, and PFOA was detected most frequently and at the highest concentrations. Okay, so based on ATSDR's evaluation of both individual PFAS and PFAS mixture effects detailed in the report, more than 230 out of 2,745 wells had PFAS at levels that could harm infants or young children. And those are shown on this map in the darker red dots. About 9% of those wells had levels that could harm all age groups, and those are the brighter red dots on the map. Now, the most likely possible health effects from this exposure are developmental effects, and the risk of developmental effects would increase as PFAS levels and exposure increased. Immune or liver effects would also be possible from exposure to the highest PFAS levels in some wells. Other sources of PFAS exposure, such as from food or consumer products, could also increase the risk of harmful health effects beyond the risk from drinking the well water alone. We found that the remaining wells with lower or no detections of PFAS, those are the gray dots shown on this map, are not expected to have harmed health. However, this conclusion is uncertain, and many of the wells were only sampled once, and PFAS levels could fluctuate over time. Adding to this uncertainty is that the knowledge about health effects of PFAS that we evaluate is still evolving. And many of the wells contained other PFAS, which have not been studied enough for us to evaluate the potential for health effects. So the next slide shows this. This is another figure from the report in which the wells are shown in blue, but the ones with these black crosshairs on them, all of those wells had additional PFAS detected that we are not able to assess or include in our evaluation of PFAS mixtures because there's limited data on them. And the final conclusion for this part is that we also found that the increased risk of developing cancer from exposure to PFAS in the area is uncertain. There is suggestive evidence that both PFOA and another compound, Pfas, are carcinogenic, but the science on PFOA, PFAS, and other PFAS is too limited at this time for us to be able to quantify or come up with a numerical estimate of this risk. Our second major conclusion is that currently harmful exposure to PFAS in the private wells has been minimized by providing alternate water and taking other actions. People who continue to drink contaminated, untreated private well water may still have an increased risk for harmful health effects. And we base this finding on the following considerations. Since 2016, bottled water has been provided to residents whose private wells were affected by PFAS. More than 750 private wells in the area have been switched to treated public water or equipped with point-of-entry treatment systems, which are regularly tested for treatment effectiveness. And some private wells with low levels of PFAS or wells with no detections may remain in use. Based on the current science, harmful health effects are unlikely if the PFAS contamination in these wells remains low. Residents who are drinking from private wells that were never tested, or those who were offered alternate water and declined, may still experience harmful health effects if they drink water with high PFAS concentrations. So next I'll go through the recommendations of our report. The first is that private well owners who had potentially harmful exposures in the past should discuss their exposure with their healthcare provider and consider taking steps to reduce other potential PFAS exposures, such as those from consumer products. And some examples of consumer products that might contain PFAS include food packaging materials, stain-resistant carpet, water-resistant clothing, cleaning products, or some cosmetics. Nursing mothers should continue to breastfeed and should contact their healthcare providers for specific concerns. Atsdr is available to consult with your healthcare providers as needed. To help protect formula-fed infants from potential exposure, caregivers should use premixed formula or reconstitute dry formula with water that does not contain PFAS. Residents using point-of-entry treatment systems to remove PFAS from private water should have these systems maintained and checked periodically, that is, according to the manufacturer's recommendations, to ensure the removal effectiveness. And residents continuing to drink from private wells should monitor their well water quality and should work with the local authorities to take appropriate action to remove any harmful contaminants if needed. And Atsdr will work with New Hampshire DES and DHHS to identify any private wells with PFAS levels of concern that have not been addressed already through previous actions. Finally, Atsdr is available to discuss individual results with private well owners or individual concerns, and will continue to be available upon request to answer other public health questions related to the site. Okay, that concludes the summary of our findings. And the full report really goes into all the technical details in our evaluation process and how we reach these conclusions. And I really encourage you to take a look at it and, if possible, read the whole report and take the time to provide feedback on the report or suggestions that might help make the report more clear or helpful to your community. We consider all the comments that we receive, and we make changes in our reports if needed to address those comments. This page gives some links for where you can download our report, but as Lori mentioned earlier, you can also find a PDF of the report in the handout section of the GoToWebinar. And finally, how do you submit public comments? Our comments have to be submitted in writing, and I've given the electronic email address for our ATSDR Record Center on this slide. It'd be helpful if you can add the subject matter so that they can make sure that we get those comments. The public comment period closes March 1st, so there's time for you to develop and send in your comments. So I also want to mention that all the comments that we receive to our Record Center will be included with responses in an appendix to the final report. The comments in the report will not list the name of who submitted the comment, but the names might be subject to release if we get a Freedom of Information Act request. Now, at this time, I'm going to be concluding the formal presentation of our findings, and we're going to start the Q&A session. But I want to remind you that while we're going to hear and respond as best we can to the questions and comments that we get tonight, our responses tonight are not necessarily our agency's official response. If you would like an official public comment in the record that will be included in the final report, your comment really has to be sent to that Record Center. So please submit your comments there as well. So helping me field questions tonight, you've already been introduced to Tara and Greg and Michelle, and I think now I believe that I have to give up my control of this and move to the Q&A. So I'll hand it back over to Lori. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and for your coming to tonight.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Tara. Yes, so we are heading into the question and answer portion of the meeting. And thank you for that great summary, Jill. So just a reminder, if you have a question, you will click on that question button as indicated by the top red arrow, and you will type in your first and last name and then press send. And this will generate a list of names. I will read the name, and then you will be unmuted by our GoToMeeting staff folks. And then you will unmute yourself, and then you'll be free to ask your question live to the ATSDR team. And hopefully that is pretty clear and straightforward. If you're having technical difficulties, you can also raise your hand and Rob Thistle will help you out, or you can call him or email him, robert.thistle@des.nh.gov. Thank you for your patience. It may take a few minutes for us to get this rolling, and it may take a few minutes as we're unmuting you and then as you're unmuting yourself. Sometimes that can be a little tricky. So, great. Thank you. So our first questioner is John Swallow. So we will unmute you, John, and then you will unmute yourself, and then you can go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Hi,
Okay,
John.
good. So I note recently that there are some high concentrations to the north and west of the area of the subject of this presentation. Namely, the town of Amherst has some disturbingly high numbers. I also have not been able to find any groundwater flow contours. Do those exist? And what do you know about Amherst?
That we did not include Amherst in our report, and I think that question is really more appropriate directed to the DES.
Yes, John, we do have folks at DES who I'm sure can answer that question for you. So if you refer to the contact information PDF and contact the folks that are listed there, and if you're not sure who, then just any of them can direct you to the right person. But that is beyond the scope of this report, unfortunately, but we will make sure that your question is answered.
What about groundwater flow contours within the study area?
Yes, that's not something that we looked at in our report because we look at the individual private well sampling data. So we were not looking at how they were flowing or anything like that. We were just looking at what people were exposed to.
Thank you, John. That will have to go to DES as well. So I appreciate your question, and they will be happy to answer it if you follow up with them when you have time to give them a call. So we'll move on to the next question. Noelle Hashke.
Yes, thank you. You mentioned that there will be a separate report for public water, and when will that be released?
This is Tara. I'll give you what I know right now. We have a draft of it. It's internal for ATSDR, so it's still going through our process. I don't know if Greg has a more realistic timeline of when we might be able to release that one.
Yes, good evening. We're hoping to release it sometime by the end of the year.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Noelle. Thank you, Greg. All right, moving on to Nicole Janos.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Hi.
Thank you.
I live in Manchester. I am right across the river from the Saint Gobain factory. And I was curious, first part of my question is, Manchester doesn't seem to be investigated as much as the other towns, according to the DHHS meeting. That's one part. Do you want me to say all my questions, or do you want to answer that first?
We really are trying to limit it to one question per person. So if you want to pick the one that is the most important to you right now, and then if you have additional ones, you can put your name in again.
Okay, I guess my most important one is, why is it just well water that we're testing? Why aren't we testing the air quality when PFOAs are in the air and PFAs are in the air? And is it just well water, or is it public water? Because there's so much cancer in my neighborhood, including 2 people in my own home, kidney and lymphoma.
Sorry to hear that. Jill or Tara, are you able
And a
to?
child.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing, and I'm sorry to hear about that. So the reason that we focused on well water here is that because of the high concentrations that were found in the water. You know, from what I understand, I think the original source was from air exposures that filtered down into groundwater. But because people are drinking that water and the concentrations were high, that there's much greater exposure there over time. Now, I do want to also say that that both the public water and the private wells were affected, but both we feel have been addressed at this point. The public water is treated now and meets drinking water standards, and the private well owners that were affected have been switched to alternate water. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
And
Thank
I'll
you,
just add,
Nicole.
we do have the public drinking water health consultation, which is looking specifically at the public drinking water systems. The reason they were divided into two documents, honestly, is we've done this at other sites too. Sometimes it's just a little clearer in the final documents if you can focus on just private wells in one and public drinking water in the other. It's easier then for residents to sort of understand where they fall in that. And the public drinking water, sometimes you get tripped up on words. The public drinking water system health consultation, it required a little bit more modeling to determine the concentrations through the system. So that's why it's a little bit slower coming out, but we will have one on the public drinking water as well.
All right, so we're going to move on to Tina Bodon.
Hello. Thank you. I had a question about who doctors can contact at the Atsdr for guidance on the exposure testing and treatment. I haven't seen anything come across the New Hampshire Health Action Network, how docs get notified of these types of issues in New Hampshire.
All right, so I'll take that one at first. So this is Tara. You can have them reach out to me and I will get them to the right resource. As the regional representative, anyone can reach out and we can get them to someone who can answer their question depending on what type of question is. It might be, we can give it to the person who can answer it best. And we're also working continuously with our New Hampshire state partners. That's part of our cooperative agreement partners through DES and DHHS, and hope to do some more clinician outreach. It's a challenging time to get to clinicians right now. As you all know, they're swamped with a lot of other information. So sometimes trying to get on the radar is a little challenging, but we do want to continue to work to get information out to clinicians. And if you yourself want to look at our Atsdr website, we have information for clinicians there that was just recently updated to a shorter version, which is a little faster for clinicians to read. You can look there for some beginning information and then you can reach out to me.
Okay, but no docs that I haven't seen anything because I'm on that Health Action Network distribution list. I haven't seen any notifications come out.
You mean like the state's HAN, that one? Is that where you're?
Yep.
So that would be a better question probably for our state partners, since the state partners are the ones who control those systems. So I don't want to speak for the states out of turn, but we can talk to them. And
Tina, I would follow up with potentially with Whitney Hammond. Even though this isn't a cancer issue, she would be able to address your question regarding the HAN and that process.
Okay.
And that's on the contact information PDF handout and the slide that we showed.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Kathleen Bemis.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So I have a question, and you probably are going to pass me to someone else, but my question is about prevention, because in the state of New Hampshire, it's actually written that any private well that is no longer used should be decommissioned, which means that it should be filled with cement so that the aquifer isn't open, so therefore contamination of other wells is prevented. Do you know why this isn't being done in this, when we're decommissioning wells in this area?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Yes, you're right.
Do you think that that would be a possible solution of preventing further spread of the PFOAs through the open aquifers?
Well, I will say that decommissioning a well, if the groundwater is already contaminated, the well's just taking out from that. So plugging it at this point, it will keep any contamination from going down the well into the aquifer for further contamination, but it won't stop what's already there.
Okay, the way that I read the law and the science is slightly different. So who can I broach that subject with at the state level?
I would be in touch with Brandon Kernan, who is in the New Hampshire DES Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau, and his
Okay.
name is listed on that contact information sheet.
All right,
His
perfect.
email and phone.
All right,
Thank
thank you so
you.
much.
All right, Charles Carrier.
Hi, Lori. This is Karen Kramer. I'm going to go ahead and read Charles's question for him. So many people in Bedford have been offered temporary water replacement therapy through periodic deliveries provided by Monadnock Water. Although this is adequate for temporary relief, a more permanent solution is needed. The Saint Gobain and/or the state do Saint Gobain and/or the state have any information regarding a more permanent fix for those of us who are not included in the hookups to either?
Thank you, Karen, for reading that, and thank you, Charles. Unless the ATSDR folks have a particular comment, I think that would need to be directed to New Hampshire DES. That might be regarding the, I believe they're through the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau, Brandon Kernan, or there may be a bottled water direct connection. I'm not remembering the sheet exactly, but I would try Brandon, and he can direct you if there's another contact person who can answer that question. All right, Norman Upson.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I had a well, I have a well, and it was fine for many years. The level has never changed as far as the PFOAs, but the state changed the level that was considered too high. Once that was done, I was notified, but I was advised that I was outside of the original agreement about drinking water for both bottled water and any other resolution to this problem. So no resolution has been the solution. I had to invest in a device to clear the water, but nothing has been done regards the destruction of my well by whomever you find responsible. What is being done about that?
Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. That's must be frustrating. So, you know, our report just looked at the exposures and possible health effects. So I think that's kind of, we're not a regulatory agency, so we don't make regulations or enforce those things. So that would have to be through the regulatory agencies of the state.
And
Yes.
okay, and who would I be expected to speak to? Because I'm sure there's hundreds of wells involved in this same situation because it was done by the state when they checked it. And we were all informed of our levels, but no resolution ever was offered.
Yes, I would again check the contact information sheet and direct your question to Brandon Kernan, who is the Bureau Chief of the Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau. And if he is not the appropriate person to respond, I'm sure he will direct you to that person.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Nancy Murphy.
Hello, thank you for taking my question. My question was already asked and it was answered. I think Greg answered it. And it was relative to the specific date of release of the public well data. And I have to say, I'm really disappointed that we're 6 years post notification of the public drinking water contamination here, and we still are waiting now for an additional 11 months to get that report on our public drinking water. Given that Merrimack residents have had long-term exposure here via multiple routes, I wonder, is there consideration being given to looking at those alternate routes of exposure, the air exposure and stuff, or are you going to just specifically be sticking to the drinking water? Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Nancy. I know that in this area, we are focused only on the water exposures, but ATSDR does have some efforts to try to understand other pathways of exposure in areas that are affected by contamination, and hopefully that work will add to some information we can provide to your community as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Rosemary Rung.
Hi, Lori. I'm gonna go ahead and answer the question for Representative Rosemary Rung. Do the low levels mentioned refer to EPA numbers or New Hampshire MCLs?
I believe the low numbers in our report refer to levels that were below our screening values that we use to look at contamination. We have a minimal risk level, which is an exposure that is not expected to result in any health effects. And so if levels are below that, we would consider those low. So that's what we use for our screening. Did that answer the question?
I think maybe we should explain a little bit about how we use numbers slightly differently than like a regulatory agency would. So with ATSDR, when we're looking at exposure, we're not the agencies that, like Jill mentioned, we're non-regulatory. So we're not setting the number with which water has to be cleaned up to, or that should be above or below. That's set by agencies within a state like DES, or at the federal level like EPA. So for our documents, what we do is we're given data for a contaminant in something like drinking water, and then we compare the levels in that data to levels that ATSDR has, that's our screening levels. And we create those screening levels. Again, it's to let us quickly look at data, or not quickly, I guess that's a relative term, to let us look at data if it's a big data set, to look at the data and determine if that is above or below our screening level. And so those screening levels we use, they're not tied to any of the regulatory numbers. So it can get sort of confusing sometimes. Again, you're right when you talk about low numbers or high numbers, because especially around PFAS, there are federal numbers, right, that the EPA set, and then states are setting numbers, and then we're talking about our screening values. And so it gets a little unclear sometimes for community members. So I think when Jill was talking about using our numbers, just to help maybe explain that a little, that our numbers that we're using in our documents, and they're in there if you look at the report, that they're, don't be surprised if what you see isn't like us just referring to the state or federal numbers. I guess that, maybe I made that less clear. I hope I made it a little clearer.
I guess I could also add in that, a lot of the numbers, all the regulatory numbers have been changing quickly as well. And so we try to stay on top of it and use the most recent things, the most recent numbers, but those things may need to be updated as time goes on. So our report is based on the numbers that we use, but as science evolves, our conclusions may change and our evaluation may change.
Thank you. Okay, Martha Smith.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I find myself in a similar situation to Norman, who spoke earlier. that I live in Londonderry, New Hampshire, and there was an agreement entered with Saint Gobain, which people refer to as the consent decree. And the people within that consent decree are getting water supplied by some outside source, I guess Saint Gobain, and I don't know who they are working with, but I'm in a situation where my well is contaminated with a, much higher number than what the state allows. And I am very close to the line of that consent decree, but just outside of it. And I have spoken to DES many times now, and they tell me that there is no resolution for me. That basically my resolution is that I pay to get a point of entry system into my home, which costs, probably several $1,000s in order to rectify this problem. And other than that, I buy my own bottled water to use for drinking and cooking. So now you've mentioned this Brandon's Curran's name. I don't know what is he going to be able to tell us that's any different? I mean, obviously you're telling us that the water is dangerous. Don't drink it.
Right. I think, well, I don't know for certain that Brandon would tell you anything differently than you already have heard from DES, but I think it might still be worth following up. There is information on the PFAS investigation website pertaining to rebates for remediation for PFAS in well water. So that information is there on that website. Representative Rung is listening in tonight and is a representative of the impacted community and a member of the Legislative Commission focused on PFAS. And if people want to, they could also reach out to her with concerns to her email, rosemarie.rung, ROSEMARIE.RUNG @leg.state.nh.us.
Can you put that information that went by pretty quickly? I didn't get it all down. Can you put that in the information that you send us when you send us the email that contains all of the information? Can you add her name? And
yes, we sure will. Yes, great idea. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you all speaking with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for asking your questions and being here. Christine Felice.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's the most asked question tonight. So my question is on your methodology. Throughout the talk and the discussion, I've heard things like, I know you can't quite quantify cancer risk, but you do have, minimum safe levels that you look at. In some instances, there are single data points from levels of PFAS in wells, and maybe even single data points from what's in people's blood. So we don't really have any time, like over time data, and likely there was exposure before 2016. How does all of this uncertainty affect how you evaluated any risk? And what do you really want us to get from this report, given that there is a lot of uncertainty? Thank you.
Okay, for cancer, that is generally when we would evaluate cancer, it would be a longer term type exposure we would look at and to estimate what potential risk would be. The issue we ran into here was that there are no numerical values for cancer slope factors that we can use that we would put into those formulas. So we weren't able to do that for this site. You know, if we had those numbers, we would, you know, generally make conservative estimates of how long the exposures might have happened, based on looking at the operation of the facility and those kind of questions to get an idea. But for this site, we couldn't. You know, our conclusions are really based on the non-cancer effects, which we found were potentially harmful. So, you know, we do recommend that we try to minimize our exposures to these PFAS. There's so many uncertainties involved in not only the sampling, but the components that are measured. I mean, there's you know, many different types of PFAS, and only a few of them really have enough scientific information for us to be able to estimate what those exposures mean. You know, lots of people are working on trying to learn more, but I think you know, our recommendations are conservative to try to reduce any exposures to PFAS at all. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think so. I think so. Even in, I guess what I take from it is even without, even excluding maybe the cancer discussion, which maybe we have to right now, there's still reason to avoid these chemicals. And that, would you say that's unknown? I guess when I read, you know, a lot of people say, well, we don't know the exact level or whatever, but it seems to me that we know these are dangerous. Is that true?
I think there's a growing body of evidence that they can be very harmful. So yes.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. Alyssa Smokler?
Hi, can you hear me? I know. Okay. I was wondering, do you have specific doctors that we could reach out to that know about PFOAs that we should be seeing if we have concerns? Because like when I go to my doctor's appointments and I bring things up down in Boston and I'm like, well, there's this article on PubMed or, you know, a good, like very knowledgeable site say, and they're like, well, we're not really sure because that's not our main focus. So they kind of dismiss it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. This is Tara. So no, we don't have like a list of providers that are like specialty providers for PFAS. There's a lot of reasons it'd be hard for us to do that as a federal agency. So like we do have the information for clinicians, and we have you know, for other sites in the past, for PFAS and non-PFAS sites, if a provider reaches out, we can try to have them, you know, connect with someone within ATSDR to answer some of those questions, to maybe help them get a better understanding of the contaminants, so then they can make some decisions for you as an individual patient. You know, it is challenging as a public health entity because we're looking at like the population of people who are exposed in communities where there's these exposures, yet on a real individual practical level, you as the person exposed really want information, you know, that you can use for yourself and for your family. And there is that always challenge that we have as a, you know.
I think the whole town of Merrimack has seen an increase of autoimmune diseases. I don't mean just me, but I also have one. So it's kind of like a catch-22. We go to the doctors with this information, they look at us and they're like, well, we don't really know. I mean, and we get the runaround.
Yeah, it is challenging. I know. And a lot of clinicians really don't have that much background in environmental exposures and in health for individuals. So I don't know if Dr. Ziegler wants to add more. She might have a more elegant way of describing it.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks to everybody who's joined tonight and participating and asking questions. I did want to bring up another resource for the area, especially when it has to do with children. So there is an entity in Boston, the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, that may be able to help folks who are concerned about issues of environmental exposure, PFAS and other chemicals that may be in the environment, that there are experts available there. And the pediatric environmental health specialty experts can connect with folks, physicians as well, to help provide information. And then, like Tara was saying, we do have doctors here with an ATSDR that can connect with physicians in different regions to help answer questions. And even we've had folks reach out specifically to physicians at ATSDR to talk about individual health issues as well. So we can provide a number of different avenues.
Okay, thanks.
I just want to quickly add before we go on to Haley Jones that the email that we will send out in a day or two after this meeting, which will include all the resources that we're talking about and these PDFs that are in the handout listing, and also the contact list, that will be included, but we will try and make an effort to really clearly identify who to contact for which questions, because we are keeping track of that. So we'll make it as clear as we can. If we weren't able to answer your question, who you need to be in touch with at New Hampshire DES or New Hampshire DHHS to get your question answered. So keep your eyes open for that email, which will come along in a day or two. So we'll move on to Haley.
Hi, good evening. Can folks hear?
Yes, thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. And thank you all so much for coming to talk with us today. My name is Haley. I'm a community organizer. And I was listening to the great recommendations that you guys are making. And it struck me that most of those are really at an individual level. And I was wondering if you have any systemic structural recommendations that towns can be working on. For example, who should be held accountable for this pollution? Who should be the ones hooking up to public water and providing long-term solutions?
Well, it's a great point, and thank you for making that. And you know, as an advisory agency, we don't generally make recommendations like that. We don't lay blame. You know, we don't identify responsible parties, but we're available to comment on like, you know, health impacts from exposures. Tara, maybe you can add more to the second part of that.
Can you, like, what was the second part? I guess I thought it was one part. I'm sorry.
The second part was where you said made an example of who should be connected to public water, and so you know, we would make a recommendation that, you know, alternate water is recommended, but you know, we don't really dictate, you know, how that is done. You know, what we're concerned about is stopping the harmful exposure, and that can be done systemically and structurally, but it can also be done on an individual basis. And you know, I think, you know, where we stop is where we say the harmful exposure needs to be stopped, and you know, we're willing to advise and things like that, but we don't make those kind of recommendations generally.
Okay, that is totally as I figured. Thank you for doing the work up to that point, and we'll take it from here.
Thank you.
Haley. Chris Bundasian.
My question is, what data will we wish we had tracked in when we're doing a 10 or 20-year retrospective study that we're possibly not tracking at the present time?
I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not qualified to answer that question. I'm sorry. If we knew that, I wish we did, yes.
That's a really good question. I'm not sure any of us have a really good answer for you. I know for PFAS specifically, you know, there is a lot of new information that's coming out pretty rapidly. It has a lot of people's attention, and ATSDR is working on a couple studies across the country that we're hoping will help start answering some questions about these non-cancer health effects with PFAS exposure. And again, the release of that information, collecting the data from the community members where the studies are taking place, and then analyzing the data and releasing that information into like reports. It is a slow process. It does take some time, but hopefully that does help answer some questions that can be applied to lots of communities that have these exposures, even though the studies are being conducted in a smaller number of communities. Hopefully that will be applicable. And I know it's really unsatisfying to feel like that information might still be a year or two away before the first information comes out. So trying to predict what you'd want to know a long time for a decade from now is really, again, yeah, like Jill said, I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question, but it is a good thing to be thinking about. So thank you for it.
If I could just follow up on that, as part of your study with the state, would you ever do a questionnaire to residents? Because we have some residents who have been ingesting water before the state even regulated air emissions, who may have had very high exposures over a very long period. And then another group of residents who had exposure to high levels, but not as long. And then more recent residents. At the present time, we don't identify those exposures, and that could give us a lot of good data. So in a way, I'm answering my own question, but it's really, would you consider doing a questionnaire to a population as part of your study?
So for these type of documents, like the one Jill wrote, a health consultation, generally we don't do a community questionnaire. Like an exposure questionnaire is kind of, I think, what you're asking about, to try to capture how much community members may be exposed. Like you ask people, like, how much water do you drink in a day, right? Or do you, I don't know, use water for other things going on, try to find out how much of that water people might be ingesting. So for health consultations, we don't generally do that. Again, with some other PFAS work that's going on with ATSDR, we have a few studies happening in some communities, and we've also done some exposure assessments or exposure investigations, where that is what we're trying to address, is trying to narrow down like how much of someone's PFAS exposure that they get in their bodies comes from like a source just like drinking water. And we are starting to get some answers to that. It does seem to be the basic answer is, if you have PFAS in your drinking water and it's elevated levels and you're drinking it over a period of time, you do get more PFAS in your body, right? That seems to make intuitive sense to a lot of people. And a lot of what we're finding seems to follow along that. So, again, as Jill said, anytime you can decrease your exposure is an exposure that's probably good to try to decrease.
Well, thank you, folks.
Sure.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going to move us on to Roger Hardy.
Yeah, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Well, my question is this, is that with the well that we have, I live in Londonderry. With the well that we have, it was tested and it did show some of the levels, and but we didn't hear anything back. One of the other things is that, can I get my well retested to verify that it's clean? And how does this have an effect over the water that I put on my garden? Feeding the vegetables and stuff like that. Is that something that I need to be concerned about as well?
That's a good question. I don't know, Jill, do you want to try to answer the vegetable part? And then
I am not sure the answer to the question. I'm wondering if Greg Eulers, Dr. Eulers, could you weigh in on that? I think you might have addressed that question in one of the reports you did, or maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah, no, not in, thank you for your question, but not in one of the reports that I did. But there definitely is that concern in different places in the country. And unfortunately, the answer is very scattered, and it really depends on a lot of different factors: the type of PFAS, the type of soil, and other kinds of chemical and physical things that go into that. And it's really not a question that has been completely answered as far as how much does a certain plant uptake. And it depends, of course, on the type of plant too, and in what part of the plant that it would actually uptake into, and maybe be a part that people would eat. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that, and it would have to be very specific to understand what was in a person's garden, soil, and things like that to try to figure that out.
Well, if I could ask a little bit more on that same thing, I'm thinking of a place like Mcls. You know, there's something that's been there for 100 years, and here's all these apples that are grown through that. So is that something that you'd be concerned about?
I don't know. It's possible, but are you planning on presenting, giving us public comments on the document?
Yeah, that's a good point, Greg. Yeah,
Chris?
that sounds like a good question to send in for a public comment, and then we can ask our experts back at the office and really prepare a good response to your question, because I think tonight we're not going to be able to give a good answer.
Okay, but going back to the first question about getting the well tested again, is that something that would be covered, or is that something I'm kind of on my own?
That would be a question for the state, Lori, in your contact list. Right?
Yep, that's a question for New Hampshire DES. And that will be in the contact information that we send out to you in an email in the next day or so. And there, we might be able to also put in the chat information on water testing, but if you go to the New Hampshire DES PFAS and get investigation website, there is a tab, a drop-down tab on well water testing. And I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, but that will provide information on the testing process. And in terms of whether the testing is covered, that would be something you would need to ask someone that you contact from that list.
Okay, I just want to, again, just like everybody else, we really appreciate everybody's time on this, because obviously it's been a big concern. So thank you very much.
Well, you're very welcome. Thank you. We appreciate you saying that, and we understand, and we want to be here to listen and answer and respond and help. Carol DePiro?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify about the study. So is this study basically done and the conclusion is avoid PFAS as much as possible? Because I found that slide really concerning about the children, the one with the red. I'm wondering, does that now go to somebody to follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, so what we looked at were all the private well data, and those were particular private wells. The ones that were colored red, yes, we found that those could have harmful health effects for children. Children are most sensitive because they're smaller and they get a higher dose when they're drinking the same amount of water. So the wells that would be of concern for children are more than the wells that would be concerned for everybody. So the ones that were colored a darker red, those were where the children could have been affected. But then, you know, when the levels got high enough and the exposures got higher, then it became where it was a problem for everybody, including people who were larger and had lower exposure, So I didn't say that quite right, but yes, but you know, it depends on the well. I mean, there were uncertainties also, but you know, we do believe that most of these wells that were found to be of concern have been addressed already. Many of the wells have been put on public water or have treatment systems, and so we don't feel that those same exposures are happening now. Certainly, if someone is still drinking that water, I would be concerned.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if that data went anywhere and those children were followed in any way.
I believe the well owners have the results from back when they were taken, and that the action was taken back when those well were provided, when the information was provided.
Okay, thank you.
Carol. And Lorene Allen.
Good evening. Thank you for all the work that you've done here, and thank you in advance for the immense amount of work that I'm sure is going into the public water report, because that's very complex with all the wells involved. So there's a couple things that I'm wondering about, and I'm not really sure about, you're using a screening value, and we hear about screening values and MRLs, and I know that's not the same as our state MCLs, but what bothers me about the numbers, or maybe I'm just wondering this, and I don't know why this is a discrepancy, but you have data from 2,700 wells. So what we know from the beginning of this investigation is in March of 2016, in May of 2016, the state was using the federal health advisory, right, for that remediation level. So by early summer of 2016, that was 70 parts per trillion for PFOA. And we'll just keep it at PFOA. There's a whole panel of PFAS in the water. We're exposed to these chemicals as a class, but for the sake of discussion, we'll talk about PFOA. So my brain has been on this gig for way too long, and it does tend to remember numbers. So when we did that first round of testing in New Hampshire in 2016, I remember we had, by the time they remediated wells and connected them to Merrimack Public Water, and some of the Bedford wells were connected to Manchester water system, there was approximately 758 wells at that point that the state asked Saint Gobain to take responsibility for. They did, and Saint Gobain quite often says, hey, we connected this amount of wells, to public water. All of those wells were over 70 PPT. So when I look at this data and I say, all right, we have 2,700 wells counted here. I know more than that has been tested to date. So maybe there's a lag time. There often is. But we're talking here about 230 wells that have levels that are probable to be harmful to children based on your screening levels. So I look at this and I say 2,700 wells in this report, 230 that look to be in the red, the most problematic, but 230 doesn't even jive with the 758 that I know were over 70 PPT back in 2016. So could you share perhaps your screening level? Because I'm not really clear on how. I know it's real complicated what you do and formulating data and all this stuff. I've heard people explain it to me, and it's not my field by any means, but there's this discrepancy in my mind between the wells that I know are over 70, at least 758. That was round one. There were more since then. So I'm going by 216 figures. I have 758 in my head, 900, I believe, ended up 900 being over that amount, and 230 problematic. So I can't resolve that in my head. Do you have any idea, any of you, because I know you were just given data, but any thoughts on how, maybe 900 wells that were deemed over the federal health advisory translate into 230 wells at I don't want to say mysterious screening value, but it is complicated how it's figured. So I hope that made sense, because my brain is troubled by that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine, for that comment. And I'm not sure I'd be able to parse out all the numbers for you tonight. So I hope you will write that down and send it in as a public comment, and we can consider it. But I will say that if you look in our report, which does go into a lot of detail, but there is a table in there that lists all the screening levels that we use. And it explains how we reached our numbers. I don't think that tonight I can give you an answer on how those numbers add up. I would have to go back and look at the report and think about your question a little bit to be able to answer that.
Thank you. Do you want me to email you my question? It'll be a little more concise than the way I said it tonight, I'm sure, or follow up with
Sure.
me.
Well, I would encourage you to send it to our record center, because then it'll go into the record, and then we'll be able to put it in the report and you'll see it. You know, we try to put them as verbatim as possible. Your name won't be attached to it, but then we can give a thorough response and try to explain exactly how we do that. But I feel like I might not completely understand the question or be able to give a good response tonight. So that's exactly what we're encouraging you all to do. When you have technical questions, please also send them to our record center so that we can include them in the final report, and then everybody who reads it will get the benefit of our response to your question. So besides those listening tonight, so that would be really helpful. So please.
Super, I'll do that. One brief follow-up. In addition to the forthcoming MVD report, can you give us a sense of what we can expect for, some support here moving forward as things evolve, as we find more information? Because, we know our exposure and clearly the science hasn't caught up yet. So is there an expectation or a role that you typically play or can play moving forward?
Well, that's a good question. This is Tara. I'll try to field some of that. So I think what we would say, as things change and more information is learned, ATSDR has sometimes in the past gone back and relooked at sites and the data that's there to update what we've said about the exposures at those sites. So I don't think ATSDR is just like done with this area. It just walks away and never has any involvement again. I think, like you've seen with your state partners, we're probably, in this for some time with you. We don't want you to feel like this for this community that we're just going to walk away when this report is completed. So I know that's not an exact answer of specific things, but I don't think we're going away. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
Thanks, Lorraine.
This is Greg Eulish. I'd like to add one more thing if I can do to help answer Lorraine's question. Lorraine, when you formulate your comment, take a look on about page 7 or table 1, which shows all the different types of screenings that were done for the various contaminants and the percentages of those above our screening level. And that will give you an idea how many wells were screened above our health comparison values.
Thank you.
Okay, Brian Tomaselli.
Hi, it's actually, well, we're both here. It's Nicole and Brian Tomaselli.
Oh, great.
Hi. So we live in Merrimack in the, quote, highly contested zone. So I completely understand, and I feel sorry for the woman in Londonderry, I forget her name, but living just outside of the zone, that was something, we kind of questioned. In round 1, we were not in the contested zone, but then they widened the radius. So I would encourage her to kind of stay on it and keep pressing her local representatives, because that radius has widened in Merrimack over the years to include our home now. So our private well tested at 62 parts per trillion. It was only tested once. We went ahead and purchased our own mitigation system for our family. We have children, and I'm not going to sit around and wait for Merrimack to figure out what to do. So we went ahead and designed our own system and had it installed. So like the gentleman from Bedford said, are we going to be compensated anyway, or is there, so it's very frustrating. And I realize a lot of people on this call probably want answers that, as doctors, you're not really here to comment on those things. But my question is, what type of health concerns are you aware of that are linked to PFAS that we should be looking for, or that people in our neighborhoods, we have several elderly neighbors here who have a lot of health ailments. They've lived their entire lives in Merrimack. And I'm also very aware that there is a school in that contested zone that was not filtered for years. And those children who attended that school, have maybe since moved on and moved out of town, but what types of health ailments should people be having an eye on that could possibly be attributed to PFAS or PFOA?
Yeah, those are good questions.
Because
Oh, sorry.
I think people I don't think people necessarily know or have some of the elderly people especially don't have they're not accessing these webinars and they're not sure what it would be necessarily connected to. But what are some of the things that, we should be carefully looking out for? I mean, we're doing everything we can in our home to mitigate our exposure. And the school board a few years ago was very active and put filtration in at all the schools. I'm very proud of them for getting that done so quickly, not waiting for the wells to be switched off or to switched over to town water. And I also wanted to just address that we were asked to decommission our well, and I think that you got to realize that decision is being put out to individual homeowners. So someone else mentioned that earlier, but my question is really around health concerns and what should people be looking for or attributing to their PFAS exposure?
Yeah, those are good questions. Dr. Ziegler, do you want to try to answer some of the health concerns that surround PFAS?
Yeah, sure, Nicole. Thank you for the question and for your concern for your family and all the families in your community as well, or the surrounding communities. So to be able to attribute PFAS to a particular health issue in a particular person is difficult because everybody has different susceptibilities. Each individual is going to be a little bit different. But the science, there's been a lot of studies done looking at PFAS exposure, particularly higher levels of PFAS exposure, like in worker populations or populations that live around sites that may contaminate the environment with PFAS. And some of the things that we do know where there's stronger evidence is associations with lipids like cholesterol. And we also know that the liver has been associated, liver effects have been associated with higher PFAS exposures as well. So change in the liver enzymes. And when we say those liver enzymes, it can indicate that they're sort of damage to the cells of the liver. For pregnant women, some of the studies actually show that there can be an increase in blood pressure during pregnancy. And so some of these things are monitored when pregnant women, or when you go in, if you're not a pregnant woman, you go in for your physical exams or your well checkups. These things are screened and looked at on a regular basis at each of the checkups. Some of the other things that have been seen in studies have to do with the immune system as well. And so a number of studies have shown a decrease in response or a decrease in the body making antibodies when vaccines are given. The science is mixed on some of these health effects, but there have been studies that show in several different vaccines that there may not be as a robust response to the vaccines. Several studies, the studies aren't as strong, but lower birth weights, but really small increments in birth weight change that likely would not lead to a clinical problem in a child. And so those are some of the things that have stronger science. The one thing is, when you talk about these health effects, some of these health effects, a lot of these health effects can be seen sort of independent of PFAS exposure as well. And so what we really recommend is being vigilant with with preventive healthcare. And so going to those checkup visits, if you are concerned that something has changed with your health, making that extra appointment with your healthcare provider. For kids, there's a lot of checkups in those first 2 years of life, and so we recommend really staying on top of those checkups and all checkups for kids. But the things that are looked at critically in those appointments is development and growth and behavior in children as well. So it's really important to maintain regular health maintenance. There are screening recommendations for things like cholesterol, and there are screening recommendations for blood pressure during pregnancy, as well as blood pressure for everybody, and then different screening tests that are used in children's visits as well. So I hope that answers your question. I mean, there's a lot we don't know and a lot still being studied, but some that we do know and that there's stronger science to support. And Tara, if you have more to add, Tara is a health expert as well, and may be able to add to that too. You're on mute.
Oh, see, I was muted this time. I think you did a nice job. Thank you. And we can, in the email we send out, we can also make sure we include the link to the health materials that ATSDR has on PFAS. So you can look there for some additional information, and through that ATSDR PFAS information, you can find the information for providers. The one pager now, it's like a shorter version if you want to talk to your provider about it. So, and if you have additional questions, you can reach out to me. I'll do my best to answer them.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on to Representative Bill Boyd.
Good evening, everybody, and to the ATSDR team, thanks so much for having this meeting tonight. It's been enlightening and informative, and it's also nice to hear some of my neighbors chiming in as well, because I've spoken with them anecdotally about their specific issues as it relates to how PFAS has impacted their own private well situation. You had one previous individual, I think her name was Haley, that was wondering if there was any efforts going on statewide regarding migrating homeowners off of private wells to public water. For the last 5 years, I've been serving on the New Hampshire Drinking Water and Groundwater Advisory Commission. We've been entrusted with managing a $250 million trust fund that came out of an MTBE settlement with ExxonMobil. Consequently, through an application process, municipalities have been able to apply for grants or loans for specific infrastructure projects that they may have going on in their community. It could involve source water development. It could involve source water or aquifer protection. Most of the stuff we've seen has involved infrastructure and upgrades to specific facilities that they have. But the larger thing that we've embarked on is beginning to connect the southern part of New Hampshire to public water in response to not just PFAS contamination, but some of the other contaminants that have permeated groundwater issues. Iron and manganese is a particular problem. There's actually a community south of Manchester that has a organic uranium problem that is infiltrating their groundwater, which it's kind of surprising to hear the word uranium coming out of the ground and having an impact on groundwater, but there's a community that is dramatically impacted by that. So there is a commission that is actively engaged right now with working with communities to provide them access to clean potable water through a public utility. The harsh reality of it is, as I'm sure all of you are aware, and I'm sure as my neighbors and some of my colleagues who are on the conference call tonight can attest to, this is going to cost money. This is not going to be a quick fix for anybody. That when you move from a private well and you choose to hook up to public water, there's going to be a cost that entails with it. And when you hook up like a subdivision or a specific neighborhood going from one particular water source to several water source, and you actually have to, go shovel ready and put pipes in the ground to connect those houses, it becomes a reality that it's big money to hook up former private well owners to public water. And there are some people, not just in my community, but that I've learned as a result of participating in the commission, that are very, very reticent about giving up their private wells. They would prefer to do the point of service piece because they don't want to get a water bill from Pennachuck. They don't want to get a water bill from Hawk. They don't want to get a water bill from MBD. And I certainly understand and respect that. But at the end of the day, there is going to be a price tag for clean water. And I wanted to at least offer that up to Haley to let her know that, there is stuff being done, and it's not public. A lot of it is being done quietly. And I thank you for the opportunity to tout the work of the commission. The question that I would ask, and I've been listening attentively, and if I missed it, I apologize for the redundancy, but the level of PFAS that's being found in the wells, one of the things that we've learned in Merrimack that was able to, identify the culprit of who tainted wells 4 and 5 was the term fingerprint. And they're able to identify this, get down to the granular level to specifically identify the fingerprint of PFAS that was found tainting the wells. My question is, did your research in looking at these private wells, did you get to that granular level where you could identify the different manufacturers of PFAS going on, or was it strictly looking at the raw data of PFAS and the levels of it in terms of, the recommendation that PFAS isn't good, is not, obviously, should not be consumed? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Representative Boyd, for your comments and your question. My answer to that is that we do not do a fingerprint analysis of the well data. We just look at what the levels were and what that exposure would mean to the people drinking that well water. The report does note that PFOA was the most predominant PFAS in this area, which is a little bit different from some other areas, and it does kind of match with what the facility used mostly, but we don't make any determinations about where the source was or anything like that in this report.
Quick follow-up.
Can we circle back to you in just a minute when I?
Sure, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much. But Representative Boyd, your comment was a great segue for me to just highlight one more piece of information, which is that there's also the HB 737 PFAS Commission, which is also working hard on this issue and is very committed. And interested citizens may want to follow the work of this commission on the New Hampshire General Court website. Several of the folks we've heard from tonight are part of that commission, and I know they meet regularly, and so that's just an additional resource for you. And we will try to also include that in the email that goes out. So I just wanted to mention that. And then, so we have a second round of one, so someone who's asking a follow-up question, which is Nicole, and then Representative Boyd, we can come back to you after we hear Nicole's question.
Hi again. Thank you for allowing me a second question. So obviously we have an issue. Obviously, Saint Gobain, who's paid for people's water for the last 6 years, or public water from well, they've claimed ownership for this, which is a problem for me. Like I said earlier, I have 2 instances of cancer in my own home. And according to the DHHS meeting last week, they're really only focusing on kidney cancer, not all types of cancer. And PFAs and PFOAs and all of that can cause multiple types of cancer, and they just seem to be focusing on kidney cancer. my neighborhood, like I said before, is covered in cancer. Many people I know have passed or are currently dealing with cancer or have been dealing with cancer. My question is, how do we know that the public water is safe? How do we know that it's not in the air anymore? Was it just one instance of when Saint Gobain like had a leak in there? I don't know the exact situation of how this happened. And I want to know how we know it's not happening again. And how do we get tested?
So
So,
the
can you address-
question, go ahead, Lori.
Nope, just punting it to you, and then, yeah. There are a couple
Well,
of
I was
things.
going to punt to New Hampshire because really the questions about what's coming out from the facility now are the state, I believe, is the regulatory agency for the facility, and they're the ones that set the permits and make sure that it's safe and that these contaminants aren't being released anymore. The public water is being treated and meets to meet the drinking water standards of the state. So those are all regulatory functions that the state is handling here, I believe.
Yes, and you, when we send out the information, or if you've already downloaded the contact information, you can talk with Kathy Beam, who handles air investigations relating to PFAS, or the Jeff for the site investigation pertaining to Saint Gobain. So they both are at New Hampshire DES, and they could answer those questions for you.
I appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, and if there are there any more comments or questions at this point?
Did Representative Boyd have another question?
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you.
No, that's okay. And to dovetail off of Ms. Chinoza's question, I actually sponsored House Bill 1536 regarding air quality in New Hampshire. I worked with DES on this. Originally, it was going to be limiting annually the specific amount of pounds that Gen X, PFAS, other particular types of contaminants would be belched into the atmosphere on a regular basis. I offered an amendment to the committee which would give DES a little bit more latitude under their rulemaking authority, that if they identify a specific study, that they can identify additional PFAS chemicals that are not already on their list of chemicals that they're already analyzing. They will certainly add those. The amendment would, if passed, would encourage DES to add those specific chemicals that are new chemicals that are not on the list. I think this, from the testimony that I got, was about 50 perfluorochemicals that are on their list that are analyzed by DES coming from smokestacks, not just Saint Gobain, but other companies that do use perfluorochemicals in their manufacturing process. Which gets to my follow-up question. What's the future? And there was one gentleman that I thought raised a good question of, what's the takeaway from 5, 10, 15 years from now? I guess the question that I would ask is, there going to be a commitment from Atsdr to focus on the next perfluorochemical and the next perfluoro 2.0, perfluoro 2.01, kind of like your Apple iOS phone update that we seem to get regularly. The chemical companies are manufacturing these new Gen X chemicals, like it seems like daily, and it's very tough, especially for members of my community who have been actively engaged in this, since the onset in 2016. It's becoming very difficult to keep up with the new chemicals. So my question is there a commitment that there will be follow-up to do additional analysis with the new chemicals as they present themselves? Or have you, in your report, have you identified, you know, chemical X, chemical Y, chemical C that doesn't have a name yet, but you've actually picked it up as a part of your analysis? And thank you again for taking my question. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So ATSDR is following the evolving science of PFAS, and we really have scientists who are really keeping up with, you know, all the latest studies that have come out. We don't typically conduct our own analysis of the PFAS in ATSDR, but we do have our lab is also studying new PFAS things. And Tara, maybe you can take over this question. I'm not quite sure. You're on mute.
Sorry, so you didn't hear the background in my home. I'm muted. I would say, yeah, and Greg might want to jump in too after. At ATSDR, we are trying to keep on top of the newest PFAS chemicals that come on the radar screen. You're right, it's a huge body of chemicals, right? And our information, as you've seen, even at the state level where states are trying to regulate these more closely, there's a lot of them we still don't have very good information on to make a health call about. And I think, you know, in the documents we're producing now, we do talk a lot about that uncertainty that we have, and that helps drive, I think, our approach is more conservative because of that, because we do know there's uncertainty surrounding these chemicals. So, you know, moving forward, I think ATSDR will continue to work on this PFAS issue. We have the studies going on across the country. We have health consultations like Jill's produced. We have the exposure assessment. So there is momentum right now behind all this at ATSDR. So, you know, stay tuned, and we hope to stay engaged with communities like the one, your community, and other communities across the country, and try to get them the information as we have it. Greg, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, Tara, I would add also too, Representative Boyd may know that we do have toxicological profiles, and our tox profile group is constantly looking at the literature, like Jill mentioned, and looking to see whether or not we can update and add to the information that we have now. As if you look at the report, we have what Jill mentioned before about minimum risk levels for the PFAS contaminants, but we are continuing to look at other PFAS contaminants to see if we have enough information to also develop those kinds of health guidelines. And those could include the kind that you're talking about, Representative.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I just want to also add that we do have a fact sheet on PFAS that's designed for general audiences. It's focused for New Hampshire audiences, and it was produced by a group of stakeholders, some of whom are here tonight. And it is on the Dartmouth College website, in the epidemiology page. It is linked to a frequently asked questions page that has a lot of good information, and it includes a list of potential health effects and connects to the most recent research studies on those potential health effects. So that's another resource, and we will include that in the email that goes out as well, in case you want to use that for yourself or to make available to your neighbors. And I just want to commend you all for being here, and I want to commend you all for your efforts and your struggles. I'm sorry for what some of you or all of you are going through, but I think this is a perfect example of bringing a community together, even virtually, where we are not only learning from the ATSDR folks here tonight, but we're learning from each other. So, and yes, I get teary very easily, so just ignore me. But does anyone else have any further questions or comments? I just want to remind you all to make sure that you submit your formal comments to ATSDR by March 1st. And that information will also be in the email. as to where to submit that, but there is a website you can go to, or you can provide it by snail mail. And we'll include that mailing address in what we send out to you. And finally, I just want to thank you all for being here and taking the time. And we will follow up, and yeah, all the best. And I think we'll say good night. Take care.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Lori.
You are welcome. Thank all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Right.